Hello and welcome to Chapter 8, the Executive Branch and the Federal Bureaucracy for PA 315. So as we read in the text, we have seen a massive growth in the executive branch of government, and that is the giant federal bureaucracy that we have today. Initially, that wasn't the case, of course. In 1789, President Washington, the first president under the new Constitution, there were only 3 departments, and those were Foreign Affairs, which later became the Department of State, the Department of War, which became the Department of Defense, and Treasury, which included the post office at that time, as the post office is actually in the Constitution. However, the post office was removed from Treasury in 1829, served as a cabinet post actually for many years until the early 70s. Later on, you saw the addition of the Department of Agriculture in 1862. This is during the Civil War, and there was a need to feed the Union troops. They felt that they had to have a standing army that was well taken care of, and therefore the need for Department of Agriculture at the time, because of shortages and general fighting over resources between the North and South, this made it necessary. Subsequent to the Civil War, which ended 1865, the Pension Office was started, and that was in 1866, and that was created for former Union soldiers. So again, we see when there's a massive need that's usually created by some sort of change or war or depression, you'll see these things come to pass, and then you'll see a new department emerge. And we still have seen this till this day, as we see with the Department of Homeland Security, created shortly after 9/11. Department of Justice, 1870. This was created to offset the high costs of hiring attorneys to handle government legal issues. This is after the Civil War. There was lots of legal issues. There was an attorney general. However, just having so many different legal cases just got too expensive by hiring independent lawyers. So they decided to create a Department of Justice to handle all of these things. And this was the initial growth in the 19th century, and then it continued to grow into the 20th century at an exponential rate. So the spoil system we talked about briefly before, to the merit system. And again, there still is the patronage or spoil system today with political appointees. That's always going to be the case. However, for the vast majority of jobs, you do have the merit system in place. So patronage system or spoil system really was around prior to 1828. It says that here, but if you remember reading in the text, President Washington, the first president under the Constitution, he wanted to have a cabinet that reflected different views. So the example that was given was Jefferson as Secretary of State and Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. They were very different. Hamilton was a Federalist, Jefferson was an anti-Federalist, and they would butt heads. And Washington felt that that was good, so that he could make the best decisions having a diverse group of opinions in the cabinet. However, once Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801, this is following John Adams, who was a Federalist. He replaced the John Adams Federalist appointees, fired them all, and replaced them with anti-Federalists who were loyal to him. So that went out the window fairly early on in the presidency. That being said, a lot of times the thought of the spoil system is associated with Andrew Jackson, which you are watching the video on him in Module 4. And you can see that he was known for a lot of things. He was this populist leader who had a lot of support from a large new group of uneducated white people who now could vote, who were not landowners. And he was unfortunately very racist and very, very poor to the Native Americans. So he had brought up the spoil system name, hence this cartoon, which was to the victors belong the spoils. That was a Jackson supporter was told, some people complaining at Congress, and hence the term spoil system came to be. And this was the way it worked until President Garfield, who was elected, and then in his first year as president, he was shot in July because he didn't give a job to someone who felt they deserved it. His name was Getchoo, and he shot him and was upset, and killed him in DC. And there were many people who didn't like the spoil system prior to this, but this gave it enough gravitas to be brought, and they said, we have to do something about it. And then you see the merit system proposed, and the Pendleton Act is what it's better known as in 1883, but it's actually the Civil Service Reform Act that was championed by the quote unquote father of public administration, which you'll hear about a lot in your other public administration courses, especially 301, President Woodrow Wilson. At this time, he was a dean of Princeton. And that over the years has really changed the civil service system. Now it covers more than 90% of federal employees. Again, spoil system's not completely gone. You still have appointments. But for many of the entry-level positions, you have to take tests and perform at a certain level to be considered. And for higher level positions, there is a competitive system with basic requirements for education levels, etc. So as the United States was growing, expanding west, you have the federal government growing tremendously. New agencies started to form. One of these was the Interstate Commerce Commission, and that was in 1887. And this was created due to railroads having monopolies on transport. So as railroads were being built across the United States, this was a massive expense by private companies, not the government. And they would charge very, very high rates for transport. It was a monopoly. And people were getting upset. They had to move goods, or they're moving people, or what have you, across the country. And they didn't like that they were being taken advantage of. And so the government steps in. Again, this is a market failure. Government steps in when there's a market failure. Those who've taken PA 200 or my other courses, PA 460. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was set up and to control monopolistic behavior of railroads. Also, what was created at the time was about 20 some years later, was the Federal Trade Commission. And this also was related to monopoly. So the Federal Trade Commission was set up to protect small businesses from large corporations. And so that went in 1913. And this is all happening during the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Era in the 1880s, you see the Pendleton Act we talked about before, bringing professionalism to government jobs and the merit system. These were part of many different things, reform measures that progressive politicians were supporting. And we can't confuse progressive, the term nowadays, a little more slanted towards liberal progressive issues. Back in this time, progressive era included many different types of very liberal issues as well as conservative issues. So some of the different things that were championed during the progressive era were more efficient in professional government. That was one. Labor rights, and this was also outlawing child labor, women's rights and suffrage, breaking up monopolies, changing the setup of local government and state government, and many other things. So in 1913, during this progressive era, you also see the splitting of the Commerce Department with the Labor Department, which makes sense. They felt that Commerce Department has two masters. One is the worker and one is the corporation that hires the worker. However, the corporation that hires the worker has a lot more clout as far as money and influence, so they should be separated. There's a conflict of interest. And so the Labor Department was set up in 1913. Also in 1913, the 16th Amendment was passed, and this created a federal income tax and created a massive new income stream for federal government. So with the federal income tax, you had money now to give to different executive branches, and with money comes the opportunity to further implement more and more policies, and government grows accordingly. So again, we see changes in government when you have changes in society, and that could be world wars, it could be the Depression, all of these other things, technology changes. And Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, the nephew of Teddy Roosevelt, he was president elected 1932, served from 33 till 1945 when he passed away, as we've discussed several times about him. You had the New Deal social programs during the Depression. Obviously, this creates a lot of need for implementation of policy. And so you're going to see lots and lots of new government workers all over the United States and new programs. In addition, once you had the growth of government from the New Deal programs, World War II raised taxes, which people were more than happy to pay at the time in the sense of war after we were attacked in Pearl Harbor by Japan. And were never lowered actually till the 80s and early 2000s. And there was a need for lots of resources, of course. Prior to the war, you had massive projects employing millions of people. And during the war, obviously, you had massive movement of resources and jobs involving millions and millions of people. So from these world wars and growth of government, there was a thought, okay, we have all of these GIs out there who are fighting, they're going to come back. What are we going to do? And the idea was, with the progressive FDR administration, that we need to do something for the veterans to give them a leg up. And several of those things changed the map and changed the composition and grew this giant middle class that we know today. So part of these benefits were the ability to have loans for college or grants to go to college, to have low interest loans to buy a house, or actually just to be able to get a loan to buy a house, which was difficult for an average person, especially working class. Healthcare benefits, all of these things were put in the GI Bill and helped create, which we discuss a lot in PA 200 and PA 460, this giant middle class that grew in this country, creating suburbs all across from the Sun Belt, and all of these things blew up out of that. This is also in conjunction with the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, which was a massive measure to build all of these interstates all around the United States, which had not existed previously. And the highway system, anything with an I, is part of that. And combining that with the GI Bill, the ability to go to college, to have upward mobility in your career when they came back from war, as well as to buy a home, helped create a mass movement to suburbs and new homes. And new homes were just growing all over the United States, within cities, as well as creating new suburbs all over the place, and creating what became this stereotypical American dream, which we talk about a lot in PA 200. Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s. This was started, of course, with the Kennedy administration, then he was assassinated, but there was the civil rights movement during that time. And you had the growth of government through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, in 1965. And this was to ensure protections in the Civil Rights Act were being enforced. You also had the addition of two cabinet departments, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Transportation. And these have become very large departments, and also carried a lot of the work in urban renewal, which had some positive and some negative results. We discussed that PA 200 quite a bit. So how many employees work in the federal executive branch? The answer is lots. Over 2 million to 2.5 million. And if you include the military, you're getting close to 4 million. However, we think, and that is a lot, but if we look actually back, there were more federal employees during World War II. And the reason, of course, is because it was World War II. You had the Great Depression programs as well. You also didn't have the technology now that could downsize a lot of these administrative positions. Everything was done by hand. The population during World War II is less than half of what the population is now. Yet government hasn't hit the same levels despite the population more than doubling since then. So again, we always have to look at things contextually. So as you can see, the federal government was fairly small. You get to the 20th century, World War I, it's growing a little bit. And then you see in the 30s, the massive growth with the New Deal project and especially World War II. And then it subsides a bit post-World War II and increases in 1965 with the Great Society, the Kennedy and Johnson plans, and the civil rights initiatives and bureaucracy that was created, including Medicare and Medicaid. So that grows. And then it went down a bit in the 90s, and that was with President Clinton, even though he was a Democrat, often associated with big government. That wasn't the case. He actually downsized government substantially more than many other presidents. And then it's been fairly stable up and down since then. You see a little bit of an increase in 2001. You had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's between 2.5 and 3 million. So who are the federal workers? So this is a bit old, and I apologize for that. It's about 10 years old, but it's what we had to use as far as a graph in the text. We're getting a new text next year, so hopefully they'll have updated some of these things. Sometimes I put my own graphs in here as well, so I don't always use what the textbook gives us. So who are the federal workers? Has it changed? It's probably a bit more diverse right now, but probably hasn't changed as much as we would like or think. So majority male, though it's fairly close. If you look at the differences, obviously you see at the lower pay ranges, and the pay ranges are a GS and then a category. So 1 through 4 at the lowest levels, it's predominantly women, as well as GS 5 through 8. So the 1 through 8, the first half are predominantly women. Then you get to the second half, the higher positions are predominantly male, probably some discrimination over the course of generations that fixes in there. If you remember, federal workers generally work a long time for the federal government. They stay there, close to 20 years. So people, work and retire. These are generally very good jobs. So it takes a little bit longer for things to change. Now, the federal government is massive. The employees that are in the Washington, D.C. in the capital area, you're looking around 20 to 25% of all of the employees there, which is a tremendous amount of these millions. So you can see how much that area depends on government jobs, which is tremendous. But that means 75 to 80% are not in Washington, D.C. So they are spread across the United States in these different regions. Right now, this is the region setup. Probably in the future, it's going to change. We've seen the Rust Belt in the north, which now is Region 5. population not decreasing, but not increasing to the level of the other regions, whereas we see regions like 4 in the South and especially 6 in Texas. These areas have exploded in population. Perhaps the regions will change in the future because of that. California generally had been growing tremendously, though it hasn't grown as much in the last census. As we saw, California lost a representative. It still grew, it just didn't grow to the level of some of these other areas. So this can change over time, is what I'm saying. We are in Region 9, as you can see, and Region 1 is New England and Boston. Region 2 is New York and New Jersey. And then you have the other regions getting larger and larger in space, but the population generally is about the same. So what are the cabinet departments? We've gone over this before, but this is something you need to know. And we have 15. We started with 3 under Washington, and it's been growing ever since. All of the cabinet departments are headed by a secretary with one exception, and that's Department of Justice, and that's the Attorney General. So everyone else would be Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Labor, etc. But Department of Justice, it is Attorney General. If we look at the different departments, as you know, many times they can do a lot more than just what the department is, what one thinks that they do. For example, Department of Agriculture, USDA, does lots of different things well outside the scope of just agriculture. Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Urban Development has lots of different roles. Department of Homeland Security was the last cabinet department to be created, and this was after 9/11. And this was an attempt to bring a lot of different other agencies, smaller agencies, under the control of one head. They felt that during 9/11, there was too many different departments that weren't connected. So this was an attempt to bring them together. Believe it or not, we didn't have a Department of Education until the last 50 years, Department of Energy as well, Health and Human Services, these came later, and Department of Veteran Affairs as well. And they felt that it was better to have Veterans Affairs separated from Department of Defense because of the needs of veterans post-military activity is a lot different than what Department of Defense should be focusing on. So federal agencies and political involvement. And political involvement, unfortunately, has gotten more intense lately. There was attempts to curtail that, however, they're not always successful. So presidential cabinet, as we discussed in the previous chapter, consists of vice president, all the cabinet department heads, the secretaries and attorney general, and whomever the president chooses, usually chief of staff and others. In the textbook, they talk about Trump's cabinet. It's pretty similar to the Biden administration cabinet, which includes the attorney general, all the secretaries, EPA administrator, director of national intelligence, U.S. trade representative, UN ambassador, that's of course the U.S. ambassador to the UN, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, SBA administrator, and this is one unique element, the presidential science advisor. So the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, part of the executive office of the president, is also part of the cabinet, and no family members. Federal agencies include 4 different types, which you read in the text. You have your cabinet departments, and those are the 15. You have a government corporation, and these are a bit different because they're independent of any department, and they are to operate as a corporation that is self-sufficient. So they provide their own funding. Now, there are times when money is injected into these. However, for the most part, that is not the case. The examples are Amtrak, the FDIC, that's Federal Deposit Insurance Company, and the Post Office, as well as you had the example in the text of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And generally, these were created when there was a market failure and there wasn't, in the market, there wasn't the opportunity or the willingness from the private sector to provide a service that the nation felt was necessary. For example, in Amtrak, you had in the 60s and late 70s, most people started either driving with the new highways or taking planes with just a massively increasing airport and air travel. And so there was less and less interest from the private sector to provide passenger transport as it wasn't economically viable. So Amtrak was created to preserve train travel in the US as passenger travel. And there's mixed reviews there. The current President Biden's a big fan of it, so we will see. But most other nations have created infrastructure, especially in Japan and China, with the high-speed rail. In Europe, you see it far more advanced than we have here. We just haven't had the investment. Most people here like to drive their car or take a flight. The other reason is the growth of the United States cities was dependent on the automobile. So you don't have these centralized core cities and villages and towns, et cetera, that are a lot more easier to build a rail network around. There's some of that, but not enough. So it's a little more complicated here. FDIC, this is to insure deposits for banks. And this is to make banks in the United States have a insurance that covers if there's money is stolen or they go out of business, et cetera, to protect those investing in the bank. So it gives people confidence in the banks. And they're fully self-supported through their funding. Banks pay the FDIC for the insurance, which no insurance company would provide by themselves. It's too risky, or at least not to everyone, maybe certain assets, but not all people. The Postal Service, that's one that's come up many times, whether that'll be replaced or not. Something to note, the Postal Service is 500,000 people. It's the second largest employer behind Walmart. So if we were to just get rid of the Postal Service, that's a lot of people out of work. So that's something to be considered. Tennessee Valley Authority, this provides power in Appalachia, traditionally poor, high levels of poverty. You didn't have a lot of interest from the private sector because they felt they couldn't make money from these people. So then the government steps in to make sure they have electricity. And a lot of that was through damming up rivers and creating hydroelectric plants and nuclear plants. Independent executive agency, these are not under any department. They're independent. They want to keep them away from politics. And you have the EPA is a good example, Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, the CIA. Of course, these also have the directors who are appointed by the president. So there is some executive control in that end. Some of the independent executive agencies, especially the Independent Regulatory Commission members, they can appoint members, but it's very difficult to get rid of them. That's different from cabinet department. A president can come in and fire everyone if they want. However, with a government corporation, independent executive agency, and independent regulatory commission, it's more difficult. And in the case of the Fed, for example, you have staggered terms so that a president can appoint someone here or there and someone retires. However, they can't just clear the whole Fed board and change everyone. That doesn't happen, or it's not allowed to happen. There's a process. Independent Regulatory Commission, FCC, SEC, OSHA, these are usually specifically created to monitor a certain type of activity or commerce. FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is looking at radio, television, etc. SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, this looks at Wall Street, the market, things of that nature, banks that trade in securities. OSHA is safety and protection at the workplace. So they're looking at workplace, make sure that they're safe environments. And these are independent, so they do not report to a department. The Hatch Act was created to limit federal employees' political activities. However, over the course of time, it's lost a lot of effect. Used to be that pretty much if you worked for the federal government, you could not participate politically. Now, you can, provided it's not during your work or using your office as a vehicle for that promotion. So they can run for office provided it's in nonpartisan elections. And nonpartisan elections, obviously, it means it's not a party election, it's just a general election, and parties are not allowed to be listed. And a lot of states have this for local government positions and certain other positions. However, they can't run in partisan elections themselves, but they may donate to political organizations. This was amended later, and they can campaign for candidates while off duty. This was amended later, and there's always a gray area there, and you see some instances of problems. We're seeing that now with the Postmaster General, who was appointed by Trump, and he was providing incentives for those in the post office to give money to the Republican Party. So that would be a violation because he did it while using his position as the Postmaster General. So who are bureaucrats? Most are part of the civil service system. Most positions are filled through competitive exams, rankings. Ranking means that it's a competitive process through human resources. To get a position, you have to have certain minimum qualifications. 10% are not part of the civil service system. We talked about that in the previous chapter. 3,500 presidential appointees. Often, most presidents don't ever get to appoint all of them. It's just too much work. Your independent regulatory commissioners, what they can appoint. Your low-level non-policy patronage positions. These usually are assistants to some of these appointees. And the spoil system still is around, as we can see. Decentralization and de-evolution. The text, when they talk about decentralization in the chapter, usually they're referring in this chapter to not having everything located in Washington, D.C., so the actual literal meaning of decentralization. However, we also talk about decentralization and de-evolution, which are important, especially when talking about the executive branch and the federal government, because we've seen, and we talk about this in the other classes, that federal control over service, actual service provision, has moved to the states through block grants over the past 50, 60 years, and then later from states to local government or even third-party nonprofits, private sector, et cetera. So that's what decentralization or de-evolution, and that's been happening at quite a rapid pace since the Nixon administration. High turnover in key positions. In first case, you have high turnover because of the political cycle. So in this case, we had a president, he was one term, so now everyone's gone and there's a whole new group coming in with the Biden administration. The other case is more of your civil service workers. There's places, especially as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, that are dangerous and lots of very difficult to get people to go work there, especially with the GS requirements. Their salaries are going to be held to that same standard as here. And so you don't see people going there. Oftentimes private sector consultants go in and do the work, and you have maybe former civil servants who work there, and now they're working for a private contractor making 2-3 times what they did. And unfortunately, that's the case, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. Make sure to watch the video Types of Bureaucracies in Module 4 as well. Again, these are short videos, but they help bring context and understanding to the topics for the chapter. Making policy through regulations. So you have this very large executive branch, and lawmakers, Congress, of course, makes the law, but oftentimes implementing that law is very complicated, and Congress realizes that they don't have the expertise to do all of the small details required for implementing large ideas. So regulations and the policies that and procedures that are created by these executive branch entities is really rulemaking. It's a quasi-legislative process. And these regulations will have the force of law in many cases. And the Administrative Procedures Act, which came about after World War II, this was designed, they realized this giant, if you remember seeing the giant growth in government from the 30s, especially with World War II, a way to make sure that these executive agencies, which now were gigantic, these departments and offices, et cetera, that there's a way to have some check and balance system to make sure that they're not getting out of control. Another issue brought up in the text is administrative adjudication. It's kind of like an arbitrator, and it's a quasi-judicial process. And this is to handle just disputes between parties within the executive branch or brought toward the executive branch. They want to handle it in-house through an arbitration process called administrative adjudication. And so that's done quite a bit between agencies. And Federal Register is very important. It is published often, and it is very, very, very long and boring. And what it does is the publication must list all the new laws, executive orders, proclamation, memorandums, etc., all the new regulations, and not just regulations, but concepts for regulations. We'll go over the process in a second, on a regular basis to make sure that that this gets to the public. So these are massive, massive things. And luckily now it is digital, so it's not these gigantic mounds of paper that one would get monthly. So how is a regulation made? And it's a complicated process, but the reason is to make sure that the stakeholders are getting involved in the process, and that the public is getting involved in the elected officials. So let's say you're an office within a department, however, you create a new rule that you draft for preliminary consideration. That rule or new regulation or procedure goes to the Office of Management and Budget, which is within the Executive Office of the President, to review the objectives and evaluate costs. So they say yay or nay on it, or they say yes, but you need to change X, Y, and Z. So they do the forecasting, etc., and say go forward or make changes or don't. So then there's an advance notice of a proposed rulemaking issue in the Federal Register. And then you have a draft of the rule that's circulated to industry affected groups, or your stakeholders. Oftentimes hearings are held if necessary. And if things go okay there, then it moves on to a proposed regulation, and that's published in the Federal Register. And so that proposed regulation is put forth in the Federal Register, and then there's 30 to 60 days that are allowed for comments from interested parties. I think the average amount of responses is about 80, but on some it can be thousands and thousands and thousands of responses depending on the issue. So the comments are evaluated both by the executive branch entity as well as by the Office of Management and Budget. They review the final version and they either approve or disapprove, or they approve with modifications. And then the new regulation is published in the Federal Register. So it's a complicated process, but felt necessary in order to have checks on the executive branch. The text talks about the iron triangle. This is an older term. So you have a bureaucratic agency, it could be a department, an agency, office, what have you, commission, and you will have a congressional committee, subcommittee, staff. These groups of people will be dealing with that bureaucratic agency quite a bit. So if you're in Congress on a certain committee that deals with the Treasury, you deal with those people, you know each other, you develop a relationship. On the other hand, you have interest groups, lobbyists, large corporations. That's the final leg of that triangle that are influencing both the agency and, of course, influencing the congressional committees, subcommittees, and staff. So that's where you could have one is to get their stakeholder interest, but the other to get the mode for corruption is possible. So how are agencies made accountable? And we'll go through each. The president has the authority to, of course, appoint and remove agency heads and other top bureaucrats in general, though there's some limitations, reorganize the bureaucracy, but needs congressional approval, make changes to an agency's annual budget proposals. However, that can be overridden by the Congress. Ignore legislative initiatives originating within the bureaucracy, though that usually doesn't end well. Initiate or adjust policies that would, if enacted by Congress, alter the bureaucracy's activities. That's a lot of finagling that goes on, and as happens often. Issue executive orders, of course, and executive actions. Congress has the authority to pass legislation that alters the bureaucracy's activities. So if something goes through, a regulation is changed, and the majority party in Congress says, nope, we don't like it, they can pass a law to change that. Congress can abolish existing programs and agencies. They can say, we don't want the Department of Treasury anymore. They can refuse to appropriate funds for certain programs, and that's a big one, the power of the purse. And they investigate agency activities and compel bureaucrats to testify about them. They have to show up to these hearings. A lot of this is done through the Government Accountability Office. And of course, we have the Office of, the Congressional Budget Office, which acts similar way as the Office of Management and Budget to look and forecast, do their own analyses. Congress, of course, can influence presidential appointments because they have to approve them. And they can write legislation to limit bureaucratic discretion, as we talked about in the text. Bureaucratic discretion, Congress can't control everything, nor can the president. So there is a level of discretion to the bureaucrat who's been tasked with implementing a policy. Judiciary has the authority to rule on whether bureaucrats have acted within the law and require policy changes to comply with the law. They can force agencies to respect the rights of individuals through hearings and other proceedings. In other words, make sure due process is being followed, and rule on the constitutionality of all challenged rules and regulations. So executive control of bureaucracy, just to expand on that, delegation of power, you have to do that. It's very difficult to control this giant bureaucracy. The appointment power, that's felt as important so that the administration goals are a priority. If not, it would be very, very difficult for any president to get much done. Reorganization of the bureaucracy, they need congressional approval, so that's a little more difficult. Executive orders are directions to agencies that have the force of law, but they can't contradict federal law. Judicial control we just talked about, so they can process injunctions or orders even before a regulation or rule is published in the Federal Register. They can say and have them forced to appear. And this could be any federal court, including the Supreme Court. It's not just the Supreme Court. We have many, many federal courts, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. Enforcement of due process rights. Again, any federal court, including the Supreme Court, can do this. Threat of litigation, any federal court, including the Supreme Court. Congressional control, ultimately confirmation or rejection of agency appointees. They can always pass a law to change it. Oversight through the Government Accountability Office and Congressional Budget Office. Investigations, and we've seen that sometimes can get political, sometimes not so much. Power of the purse, budget authorization, that's a biggie. Appropriations, how much each group is going to get, can be very specific from Congress. And finally, make sure to watch the video, The National Debt, in Module 4. And that's it for this chapter, and I will see you at the next one.